How's everybody doing? I'm back again. This time I wanted to talk about format changes that I wanted to see in the LCS, and fortunately some were just made that I wanted to talk about, so that's good news, and also tie this into more international tournaments. So the big thing, there was changes for both NA and EU, but the bigger changes were for how the EU system was actually formatted versus like policy changes, which is mostly what we saw for North America. So the EU LCS changes, the big thing is that they're introducing conferences or groups. It's North American bias to call them conferences. I don't know what people call them in European sports, but in NA, it's basically you break the league in two and people focus more on their conference, but there's still some interconference play. They made it sound like it's going to get broken up into two groups and you play your group once, then the other group once, and then your group again is how that's all going to go. And I think it's pretty exciting. There's a lot of cool things about it. In particular, the way the conferences are actually going to get made. I was really hoping for conferences to come around at some point, but it was always this kind of question of how do you make it fair? And I think the way that they did it is actually really fair and really cool. Basically, the two highest placed teams from 2016 are going to kind of be the first to go in their groups respectively, so group 1 and group 2, and then the first person to go in group 1 picks a team to go into group 2, and then group 2 picks one to go into group 1, and then those teams pick the next, and they kind of zigzag back and forth, and they'll have a graphic up there explaining it. But I think that's a really cool way of doing it, as opposed to just doing it completely based off last season, where there's so much that changes and it's somewhat subjective, and I wouldn't want Riot to be the ones deciding the conferences, and having teams do it is really cool and gives an extra story there, which I really, really like. That said, I'm not sure that they're pushing the idea of conferences far enough for all the changes that I would want to see come out of it. So this basically comes from my opinion that the LCS season is a little bit too long as it is. We often see that viewership numbers start dropping after week 5, most commonly around 6, 7, 8, and then they come back up for week 9 as the season kind of concludes, and people want to see how the season ends. But those couple weeks after we've gone through the rotation once and everyone's played each other and we kind of understand how good each team is, there's less following for lower teams and high teams when they interact, and I think shaving down the amount of games just a little bit, not a ton, is really beneficial. A big part of that is because I think you still want teams to play a lot to get practice and improve over the course of the season, but reducing it by about, a quarter, which is basically what's happening here because you don't play the other 5 teams again. So you're basically taking off about 25% of the season, which I think is the ideal amount. So despite cutting down on the number of games, the European broadcast isn't actually, or the season isn't getting any shorter, and it's mostly just helping out the broadcast be easier for them, I think. The NA LCS is still doing their dual stream setup with 2 best-of-3s a day plus the Friday games. And the European LCS is changing over to be 2 best-of-3s a day, but only 1 stream as opposed to 2 for the NA. And then they're going to do it on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and occasionally on Sunday. And so they're basically just spreading out their games more. If I understand it correctly, that means not every single team will be doing 2 games a week for the European LCS, assuming I understood that correctly. And overall, I think it's a step in the right direction to have the conferences, but they're not pushing it far enough, and I'd rather see them kind of adapt the faster paced schedule that we see in NA, but with the conferences to cut out on some of those more boring games and start opening up time for other things. So it's not just that I want the season to be shorter for no reason because there's a little bit of viewership burnout, but I'd want to see them take that time to move towards better things. So you keep let's say the playoffs the same, you take the 2 to 3 weeks that you shave off from the season and put it into better international tournaments during the off season. If there's more downtime, maybe you can even have more of them. So maybe you have 1 big Riot one and 1 big third-party one or something like that. I think that's what I'd want to see is put more emphasis on big third-party tournaments, because we have Worlds, but that's what most people think of for the year. I mean, MSI was really cool as a hype story for CLG, but you hardly ever hear about it anymore, which would be fine if it had the same prestige as Worlds or something like that, which obviously MSI doesn't because there's only 6 teams there. So I would rather see something where not necessarily a major system like the CSGO scene has, but just something where there's a big prestigious tournament in the first half of the year as well, because let's be honest, the game patches and changes so much, it's a little disingenuous to treat the success of a team at the end of the season as if, oh yeah, they were building up this way the whole year, because the game changed. They might have been better on this patch than they were in the past. They're not strictly a better team. And I think that narrative is I think, implicitly understood by a lot of people, but it's usually not in the forefront of conversation, and it's not really fun when it is. People don't like talking about like, oh, SKT won Worlds for the 3rd time in a row, but they were struggling earlier and blah, blah, blah. I think just having more competitive international competitions would be more interesting. I know they won MSI and all that. I'm just saying that I personally would like to see more large international tournaments. And I think if you shorten the LCS season, there's not as much burnout and those kinds of things. You can kind of put more in those off seasons. So let's say you have the main Riot one that's like, oh, that's the big international tournament. But if you have another one in the off season, that's great for the teams that didn't go to that one and are keeping their rosters mostly the same. On the flip side of playoffs and international competition, there's also the bottom end of the spectrum, and I have a little bit of a concern about how the EU LCS is approaching that. They're saying that they're just gonna take the 2 worst teams from each or the worst team from each conference and stick them into the relegation tournament. And I personally don't really like that, because there's always that possibility that the team that you're putting in from there isn't actually as bad as, say, the 2nd worst team in the other conference. Like, the conferences might not be equally strength. And I agree if someone said, well, that team should just not get relegated if they deserve to be in the LCS. And I agree. I'm not saying that's not the case, but you can be more fair if you want to. You're sending the top 3 teams of each group into playoffs. Why not send the bottom 2 of each conference into a kind of Swiss kind of competition where the 2 teams who fall out of the Swiss one end up in the promotion relegation tournament? I would prefer to see that. It's a small nitpick, like I said, because really, if the team shouldn't get relegated, then they should win. And especially with them moving to the double elimination best of 5 format, as opposed to what we've kind of seen in the past years. So it's better, but it still doesn't really sit well with me when you can arguably have 2 of the worst teams in a single conference and one of them just gets a free pass. I would rather see them both. And I think having some kind of small, fast thing, you don't need to hype it up, it doesn't need to be a big deal, but just something at the end of the season, before playoffs, you have this kind of tournament where you get to see who's going to end up actually in the promotion relegation, as opposed to just grabbing 2 of them. And I personally, overall, am really happy with the change. I think conferences also add just cool storylines. Like, you have the first time when they all play in their own conference, and you get the hype where it's like, oh, it's the first inter-conference rivals. We get to see which conference is stronger, and you get all these different discussions and narratives that come out of it that I personally find really interesting, and I like them. That's also coming kind of from a North American sport bias. Like, we have these in almost every single sport, and I think they're always pretty interesting. It gets pretty annoying sometimes when you see that like the playoffs are done where like the 2 best teams can play off before the finals, the kind of way that you might see with Worlds and things like that. And you even see in LCS as it is right now. So that's why I don't think it's a huge deal. Just in general, I think the season being a little bit shorter helps players to reduce burnout, helps reduce fan burnout, helps give room for bigger international tournaments, which is all things I think people really want. And I don't think people would be crying over a little bit shorter of a season. And I think conferences are a step in the right direction, but I think it would be better to see the season shorten with it, not just the number of games drop. Overall, though, I'm really excited with what conferences can bring to the LCS, and I hope North America adopts it. And as much as it pains me to lose regular season time, because I mean, I'm working those events most likely, so I would want to do that, have work forever. The season goes on forever, but at the same time, I do think there's a lot of benefits to having a little bit shorter of a season right now, and conferences are a step in the right direction of doing it, and they're getting a lot of stuff right with it on their first try. Anyways, I'm glad that Riot's changing it up again. They've always done a good job about changing their policies and formats to best fit what they think works for their market. So overall, I'm very excited for it, and I hope they continue to push the idea further. That's it for me this time, and until my next video, see you guys later.